everyone, and welcome back to my channel, or welcome to my channel if you are new. For today's video, I am going to be sharing with you all of the books that I read in March, so let's jump into some statistics. I ended up reading 6 books in March and a total of about 1,901 pages. I read 1 classic, 2 fantasies, 1 nonfiction, 1 historical, and 1 horror. I had 1 2-star rating, 4 4-star ratings, and 1 5-star rating, so overall it was a pretty decent reading month. 4 of the books that I read were YA, and 2 of them were adult, and 5 of them were physical, and 1 was an audiobook, which is pretty rare for me. I also thought I would start including in these statistics the years that I read of the different books. So I read a 2019, a 2017, a 2014, another 2017, 1812, that was the classic, and another 2019. So I have read so far 2 of my most anticipated releases for the year. I don't know if I read any in January, February, but I'm pretty happy that I've read 2 so far. So jumping into the first book that I finished, that was The Gilded Wolves, a YA urban fantasy, possibly magical realism. I'm not really sure, that genre kind of confuses me, but it's definitely like an urban fantasy. It is set in Paris in 1889. Follow this group of like 6 characters that are trying to commit this heist and get this magical historical artifact. So I ended up giving this book 4 out of 5 stars. I really enjoyed it. If you've heard about this book at all on BookTube, you've probably heard it compared to Six of Crows, and it definitely was kind of similar, almost too similar at times, but I'm going to give it a pass. As far as the plot goes, besides the fact that it's a heist story, it's not really similar to Six of Crows at all, but the characters have very like similar personalities, or like kind of the same sort of like token characters that they have in Six of Crows. But nonetheless, I absolutely adored the characters in here, and they're definitely some of my favorites. I cannot wait for the second book to come out and see where their story goes. And much like Six of Crows, they were also very diverse characters. So we had characters of color, they were queer characters, I think one of them was Jewish. There was a whole lot of representation in here, which is awesome. The only reason I didn't give it a full 5 stars, and I've heard other people say this as well, was the plot was kind of really confusing. I don't feel like the magical elements were really explained that well. Like, I'm not really sure exactly how the magic system really worked. So this was definitely a story that really relied on it being like a character-driven story, because that's really where it hit the 4 stars with me, was the characters, because yeah, I just was kind of confused about the plot. That being said, I do really enjoy plots that are based on, or like focus on trying to find historical artifacts, but ones that are like biblical. If I remember correctly, in this book they're trying to find a fragment of the Tower of Babel. That part of the plot I really liked, but like the overarching story and the whole magic system just kind of went over my head. Next up, I listened to the audiobook for There's Someone Inside Your House by Stephanie Perkins. This is a YA horror novel. It's I guess it's like a slasher, if you would say. A lot of people have compared it to Scream, which I've never seen, so I can't really give you my thoughts on that side of it. But what I can say was this is actually the second time me trying to read this book. The first time I tried to just physically read it, and I ended up DNFing it pretty close to the beginning. But this time I decided to listen to the audiobook, and I made it all the way to the end, so that's good. So I ended up giving this book 2 stars, and here's the thing. Like I said, it's very much compared to Scream, which I guess maybe that's what the Scream franchise is about as well, but this book seemed to be like 25% horror, 75% high school drama. You know, I'm just not really about that high school drama in YA anymore. That's why I'm kind of branching more out into adult and stuff like that, because I'm over that. I don't really like to explain the plots of horror or thriller novels, but just to give you like a general idea of what it's about, I don't think it's really going to take away from the effect of the novel if you like it or not. But we basically follow a girl who has just moved in with her grandma in this really small town, but she's originally from Hawaii, but something, we don't know what happened to her, and she's trying to like get away from this dark thing in her past. And so now she's at this new school in this teeny tiny town in the middle of Nebraska, I think, and suddenly there are these students that are being murdered in these really gruesome ways. So the most frustrating thing about this novel is that I really didn't like the high school, like contemporary kind of parts, but the parts that were horror were really good. It was like every few chapters you would get a chapter from the perspective of the victim, and it was genuinely like edge of your seat kind of stuff. And even like this is gonna sound weird, but like the killings, they were very gruesome, kind of not what I expected in a YA novel, but you know, as a horror fan, I appreciate that it got that dark. That's a weird thing to say. And so it like really stinks that I didn't like the other 75% of the novel that was all high school, contemporary, romancy kind of stuff. So I ended up giving it 2 stars. It wasn't horrible, but I definitely just didn't really like it that much. The next book I finished was Smoke Gets in Your Eyes and Other Lessons from the Crematory by Caitlin Doughty. This is a non-fiction novel. If you don't know who Caitlin Doughty is, she actually has a YouTube channel called Ask a Mortician. She is a mortician, if you can tell. And she basically makes videos about that, about working as a mortician and death and all that kind of process of what happens after you die. All that kind of morbid, macabre stuff. So I knew she had written a book, and I think she's actually written 2 books now, so I decided to finally pick it up, and I'm so glad that I did because I really enjoyed it. I gave it 4 out of 5 stars. This book just kind of talks about her story going to work at a crematory for the first time, and it just kind of talks about society's view on death and how her view on death changed after she worked in that setting for a long time. This book definitely made me think about the different processes of grieving and death and what you can do afterwards. Something that Caitlin Doughty is like very passionate about and really strongly encourages is like families being more involved after a family member has passed away, because we tend to just like, when a family member dies, you just kind of pass them off to a funeral home and they deal with everything, whereas back in the day, and even still in other cultures, the families were responsible for taking care of the body and washing it and preparing it for a funeral or a burial or a viewing or whatever. They were responsible for it, and the bodies were usually kept inside the house and they weren't like passed off to somebody else to deal with it. So yeah, I really enjoyed reading this. It was really thought-provoking, and I'm definitely interested in picking up her other novel. Next up, I finished Now I Rise by Kiersten White. This is the 2nd book in the And I Darken trilogy, I think. If you don't know what this series is about, it's basically the story of Vlad the Impaler, but a gender-bent version where he is a woman. I read Now I Rise last month and I really liked it, so I very quickly picked up the next book, and I really enjoyed this one as well. I gave this book 4 out of 5 stars, which is the same rating that I gave the first book, but I think I enjoyed the first book a little bit more than this one. My favorite thing about this series is definitely the characters, and an element of the first book that I really liked was the dynamic between the 3 main characters, whereas in this book, those 3 characters were pretty much apart the entire time, so we never really got to see them together. That being said, I still enjoyed reading about them separately, but you know what I'm saying. The series also tends to focus a lot on like the war and planning of the war and just like very political kind of stuff that I'm not super interested in, and tends to kind of make the plot go slow for me. But I still really enjoyed it, and like I said, the characters are definitely the thing that makes this series for me. So I have the 3rd book. I've rented it from the library already, so I'm very excited to start that soon. The next book that I read was Snow White and the 7 Dwarfs, and this was only about 10 pages long, but we're going to count it as a full book just for the sake of my reading challenge, which I'm 3 books behind in, and it's really freaking me out. Snow White and the 7 Dwarfs. I had never read it before, and I'm very much interested in reading all of the like Grimm's fairy tales and Hans Christian Andersen, just because they have such a reputation of being super duper dark. And of all of the fairy tales that I've read, this one was definitely the darkest, I guess. I don't know, they're never really as dark as everyone seems to say that they are, so it's always kind of underwhelming when I read them, but still, I really enjoyed it, so I gave it 5 out of 5 stars. When it comes to like, especially classics just in general, it's hard to like rate them on the same scale that you would rate like a modern day book, so I just gave it 5 out of 5 stars because it's a classic. It's a fairy tale. I love them. it's 5 out of 5 stars. So then the final book that I read in March was Stain by A.G. Howard. This is a retelling of Princess and the Pea. In this novel, there are these two kingdoms that were split in half, and one of them is just always daytime, and it's like rules over the daytime creatures, and then there's the other kingdom that is always nighttime, and they rule over the night creatures and the shadows and all of that. So we follow our main character called Lyra, or Lyra, I'm not really sure how to say her name, but she looks like she does on the cover. She's got bluish white skin and this white hair and really long eyelashes, and when she touches sunlight, when her skin touches sunlight, it burns because she is basically like born of the nighttime. But unfortunately, she was born to the king and queen of the daytime kingdom, so she basically has to spend her whole day inside, never making contact with the sunlight, or that wouldn't be a good time for her. And another thing that I always forget to mention about this book when I talk about it is that she also can't speak. It's written like if she tries to talk or anything, there's just this beautiful melody that comes out, so she can't really communicate. So the kingdom teaches her this like ancient language that is basically sign language, so I thought that that was like a really interesting element to the story. I gave this book 4 out of 5 stars, and I feel like I don't really have a lot of thoughts to say about it. I just kind of really enjoyed it. All of it was just like a good time to read. The writing is extremely beautiful, which usually I don't like because that kind of writing doesn't really flow right in my mind for whatever reason when I read it. So it makes it go by a lot slower because I have to reread sentences and I get confused a lot. And that kind of happened in this book, but not as bad as it usually does, so I didn't really mind it, and I did find the writing to be really beautiful in that sense. I really loved the setting of these two kingdoms and it being always daytime, and just the palace and the atmosphere of it all. And I also did really like all of the characters, although I did find it kind of difficult to really connect to any of them, especially the main character. I vlogged my whole experience reading this book, so I kind of talked about all of this in my vlog, but in it I mentioned how the love interest as well as another more of a side character, I felt way more connected to those two than I did for our like main character, which is kind of strange. This book is also very slow paced, which isn't a bad thing obviously, but it just, you know, it got slow at times. Yeah, like I said, I feel like I don't really have a whole lot of thoughts on this except for just generally I really liked it. So those were all of the books that I read in March. Leave me a comment down below and let me know if you've read any of these books and what you thought of them. Please give this video a thumbs up if you enjoyed it, and subscribe if you haven't already, and I will see you in my next one. Bye!
You hear that, Samson?